right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to another episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don Pizzette, back again with Mr. Ronnie Wong. How's it going, Ronnie?
I am doing well this morning. My Carmen Electra tattoo cover-up went very well.
Excellent.
So
excellent.
I'm doing well.
What did you get? A pink unicorn?
Two pink unicorns.
Pink unicorns butting
That's
heads,
right.
right? Because that's the manliest tattoo that we can arrange. All right. Well, speaking of tattoo cover-ups, right? If you're in that situation, it's probably because in your life you made some bad decisions, right? Good
Carmen Electra
decisions.
that was a bad decision.
Good decisions don't lead to tattoo cover-ups.
There we go.
And how could we avoid that? With good planning. See, this is an awesome segue. All right, so in project management, we mentioned in a previous episode there's 5 phases we need to worry about.
Right.
Actually, here, let me bring up our phases diagram. I got that thing sitting around here somewhere. And there we go. Our 5 phases, I've got the logical diagram here, which I like a little better anyway. But initiation is what we covered in the last episode, just kind of getting started. And the next one is planning. And there is no substitute for good planning. You need to dedicate some time to this. In fact, in many projects, you'll spend more time planning than you actually do in execution, monitoring, controlling, and closing. That, the bulk of your time is spent here. And I know I've used NASA as an example a few times just because they're high visibility projects. When they send a rocket into space to deploy a satellite, that mission takes 3-4 days, but it might have had years of planning leading up to it because they want to make sure they have the best information possible. Now, in the private sector, we don't normally have years to make something happen, right? Especially not in IT. Time will pass us by. So we typically have to be faster, but you still want to make sure you perform adequate planning. Good planning now can save you from that tattoo cover-up later on, right?
Yeah. Many project managers will pretty much tell you that, hey, projects don't really fail at the end. When you talk about the idea of project failure, it normally happens at the beginning. In other words, during the planning stage, that if we're not careful here, if we don't try and get as much information as we can here, that's where the project really begins to fail. So it is really actually, for our sake here, right, important that we actually understand everything that we can about the planning stage.
Yep. And so the PMI recognizes this, and they address it with a process all itself. And this is a super important one. Let me pull the PMBOK up here. Here we go. So when we take a look at, yesterday or last episode, whenever it was, we wrapped up initiating, and so that's done. Now we're moving into planning, and the very first process group that we have here is the first process is the Develop Project Management Plan. All right. Now this is kind of a funny one, and you're going to see this kind of throughout the processes. Anytime you see that word, develop a plan, right? That doesn't mean we're actually planning for our project. We're planning. What have I done? We're planning for projects in general, right? So we're saying we need to come up with a plan of how we're going to manage our project, right? So it doesn't matter what the project is per se. There are little variations from project to project, but just overall, how are we going to manage this project? All right. So they call that developing the project management plan, and what it is a collection of safeguards to make sure that we've taken a look at all the things that we need to look at, that we've done our due diligence, that we've gathered the information we needed before we make decisions, so we ensure that we're doing the proper level of planning. You don't have to do this process. You can leave this off. Just say, screw it, I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants. You can do that. But then halfway through the project, when you realize, ooh, I really should have sent out some quotes and bids, I should have had a backup seller in case one fell through, then you'll say, I wish I would have thought of that back in planning. If you've got a good project management plan in place, then you'll know to do that stuff early on. You'll know if you're missing something, and you can take care of that before it becomes an issue down the road. Really important.
Yeah, to tell you how important this is to the idea of PMI, right? Of those 47 actual actions that we can do, okay, 24 of them reside in this particular group here. So, I mean, you can't say that, hey, they didn't emphasize this enough. So if 24 out of the 47 actually reside here, and the rest of them are actually divided over the other process groups, you got to realize that this is by far the most important thing we're going to do.
Did you count those, Ronnie, or did you read
that?
You did?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. When I read it, I was like, no, that's not true. Oh, it is. It is true.
All right, so obviously we got a lot of effort here in planning, and it all starts right here with coming up with the plan for our planning, right? And so it's develop a project management plan. And it looks like a very simple little process, but the challenge with this process is how many outputs it has. Let me go back to my diagram. And if we go into our develop a project management plan, we've got our inputs that feed into it, which is really all the data we have at this point. Now, if we just initiated, we probably don't have a lot of input. We have a project charter, right? We got to have that. Don't go into planning without a project charter. So we should have that. And enterprise environmental factors, organizational process assets, those ones we've already talked about. But then you see this, output from other processes. Well, we've only had 2 processes so far, and their output was the project charter, right? That was basically what we created, and a brief look at a requirements document, not anything heavy, and that really ended up in the charter too. So what are they talking about there when they say output from other processes? Well, they're talking about output from other planning processes. So if we look down here, develop a project management plan, that plan is made up of several sub-plans, right? And actually, Ronnie, you listed them in the notes, didn't you?
Yep.
Here. So the project management plan is what we're going to be creating. That's our output, and it looks really simple right here, right? Just project management plan, easy, one output.
That's it.
But it's made up of sub-plans that are all these things. Your scope management plan, your requirements, schedule, cost, quality, all these individual plans that say how you're going to manage that particular aspect of your project, all right? So cost. How am I going to manage that? How am I going to manage coming up with estimates for what things are going to cost? How am I going to manage, assigning budgets, tracking it? Who's going to be writing the checks? How do I handle all that stuff? Well, your cost management plan will tell you exactly how you're supposed to manage the cost and how you're supposed to handle that. And so you would just take that cost management plan and go down it and fill out the information as it pertains to your project, and now you would know how that works. And that would become a part of your project management plan. So building this is a lot of work. I might not be able to build that cost management plan right now. I might need to go and take a look at my costs. I haven't even looked at them yet, right? And if we go here, we'll see down in cost, right? Project cost management. You'll see in here, plan cost management. That is coming up with that particular part, that cost management plan, which will become a part of the project management plan. So you don't just sit down and say, I'm going to whip out a project management plan like this. No, you're going to have to come back to this several times. So you might do a quick draft that's very, very simple, maybe 1 page. And then as you go through these other processes, you come back to the management plan and you add to it, all right? That's what happens if we have absolutely nothing to go on in the first place. If this is the first formal project management activity that we've ever performed, all right? But for most companies, that's not the case. Most companies already have formal project management in place. And so they already have a project management plan and all the subsidiary plans. They've already got these drawn up. And all we have to do is to adjust them to meet our needs, all right? So when we look at this entry here in the PMBOK, this first entry here, this 4.2, develop a project management plan, that's really referring to companies that already have formal project management in place. All we do, and this would be a organizational process asset, right? Our company already has it.
Right.
We go to our PMO or our project management manager or whoever it is that's our boss, and we say, hey, can I have a copy of our standard project management plan? And they'll give you what will likely be a book, and it will contain all of this stuff. The overall project management plan, as well as templates for scope management, requirements management, all of these other things, and maybe others, right? We got that, may include others. So they'll give you this booklet that has all that data, and you then just have to go through and fill it out as it pertains to your project, all right? So in that environment, you might be able to just get started right away, right here, doing this, okay? But if this is the very first time, the first formal project management, nobody else in the company has done it before, they're not going to have that plan. And so you might have to put this one on hold. You might have to say, you know what, I'm not going to start here with the management plan because I just don't have enough information to know what's going to go in there. And so then you skip it and you move to these other guys. You start working on them. And as you work on them, each one, if you look down the line here, see how each one, plan scope management, plan schedule management, plan cost management, plan quality management, plan human resources management, each one is generating their individual plan. And so you may move through each knowledge area, right? Over here on the left side, these are our knowledge areas. You might move through each knowledge area and create a plan one by one. And when you're done, you then combine all of those plans into one big super plan, and that's what fulfills the needs of this first process group, right? So one of the things I want to make sure I drive home with you guys that everybody has a good understanding of is, while the project has a certain chronological order that it follows, initiate, then plan, then execute and monitor at the same time, then close, right? Because that's the kind of the normal process that we follow. That's fine up there at the process groups, at the phases, right? But inside of a phase, it's not chronological anymore, right? So you might be jumping way down here to cost management before you've done scope management, right? It's not the greatest idea, but you can, So you might be moving things around, or they might be happening at the same time. You have different teams planning. These are all things that we need to be aware of. All right, so let's say, let's pretend, Ronnie, that that we've got a project to do, and we've got no formal project infrastructure in place. It hasn't been done before. All right. The first thing that you're going to need are templates, and we talked a bit about templates, and I think we edited it out, so you guys probably didn't see it in the show, but I refer to some templates that were on PMI's website, and they were made in an older version of Microsoft Office, and they were just a nightmare. When I loaded them up in the newest version of Office, I just couldn't work with them. So I burned some midnight oil last night, and I've actually rewritten the majority of those templates in the current Microsoft Word format, and I think I did one in Excel. So I'll post those. We'll put them on the website so you guys can download them. And the ones from PMI, they're just basically supposed to serve as that first step, and then you customize them as you need. So you can use mine and customize them if you want. But that project management plan, the plan itself might actually be pretty simple, but all those sub-plans is where the real data comes from. So I've been kind of churning through those, and let me figure out where I put those here. All right, so if we look here, just kind of looking at my list of documents that I've made, you'll notice that I don't have a single document that's called Project Management Plan. That there's no one template that's the Project Management Plan. It's made up of all the individual components that fall inside of it. So if I look back here, some of the or look at Ronnie's notes. Here we go. Look at some of these. The first one is the Scope Management Plan, right? So I want to have that Scope Management Plan. That's a real important thing for me. So I'll go back to my my templates here, and I'll find my Scope Management Plan. All right, and so here is an example of a scope management plan, and it's really simple. It's all blank right now. We just need to fill it in with our information, and we're going to specify things like, well, how are we going to develop our scope statement? Now, we haven't really talked about scope yet, and we're going to do that in a later episode, but this is going to be the governing, the scope statement is the governing statement that defines what you're going to do in your project, right? So it is the main judge of how you know when your project is done and successful, right? So how do we develop that scope statement? How do we come up with it, right? We need to have a methodology of how we create that scope statement. What steps can we take? Well, we might just go and follow the develop a scope statement process, right? And follow its methods. And so we would put that here and say, in order to create a scope statement, you need to use these tools and steps. And do I have that? Let's see. Plan scope management. Here, define a scope. All right, so here's the define a scope process. And you'll see in the tools and techniques, we've got expert judgment, product analysis, alternatives generation, facilitated workshops. These are all different things we could use. And so in that plan, which is in Word. There we go. So in that plan, I would specify what tools we would use as part of our company. So facilitated workshop. So we would put in here, run a facilitated workshop with the known stakeholders to come up with the requirements and build a scope statement, right? Very simple, general thing that's indicating what tools to use, how to go about it, and who to get involved, right? Just think like who, what, when, where, why, the big 5 questions, except the when and where is going to vary from project to project. So our general statements are going to be more of a who, what, and why kind of thing. All right, and then it goes on with other documents that we're going to need. How do we create our work breakdown structure? Our WBS structure, our work breakdown structure. How do we create a work breakdown structure dictionary and what should be in it? How do we do scope baseline maintenance? In other words, how do we handle changes to the scope? What defines the methods that allow for deliverable acceptance? If I say the project is done, I'm done. That means I finished something. I need to give it to the sponsor to say, here's what you asked for, it's done. Well, what are the criteria for them to accept it? Because they might say, no, it's not done. That's not what I wanted. And now you're left saying, well, I think we're done. You don't think we're done. What do we do? Now we've got conflict, right? So we would need to define what it is that means this project is actually done. And then scope and requirements integration. Scope and requirements, we'll see this in a later episode, are very, very similar. So do we just merge them and have it where the scope is the set of requirements? Well, that's not always possible, especially in software development where we might have a ton of little, tiny, very specific requirements. So we break them out into pieces. And so now, how do we tie those together? How are they integrated? When I measure acceptance, am I measuring it just against the scope, or the scope and the requirements, or just the requirements? What am I looking at? We define that here, saying, here's how we're going to manage it. Here's how we make that decision. All right. We're not actually putting the scope in here. We're not actually putting the requirements in here. We're saying, how do we manage the scope? How do we manage the requirements? All right. That's what these plans are all about. And the key thing to remember is to keep them generic. Because once you've developed them one time, you can reuse them over and over and over again in all of your other projects. You might have to make minor tweaks, to deal with uniqueness on a particular project. But for the most part, you'll find where you can reuse this stuff over and over, and it's very, very handy. And that's where these templates are kind of convenient. That's why I wanted to make sure that you guys had those, is there's a ton of them, right? Let's get these, see if I can pull this up side by side. See if my navigation skills are up to snuff here. So we've got like the scope management plan, requirements management plan, and so that's the next one here, requirements management plan. And we'll see the same thing. How do we collect the requirements? Do we talk to the sponsor on the phone? Do we bring in a subject matter expert for a second opinion? You get that a lot, right? We were using the arcade game, arcade cabinet example last episode. Nate says, I want an arcade cabinet, but he's not an expert in making arcade cabinets. So his requirements may be leaving some things out. Some of them might be non-realistic. I don't really know. Yeah. So in my collection, I might have a statement that says, step one, get a list of what the customer wants or what the originator, sponsor, whatever wants. Step two, bounce that off a subject matter expert to verify, whether that's complete or if we need more information. And you see this in web development all the time. Yeah. Somebody says, I want a website, and they want menus that look nice, and they want a form to be able to submit email, right? And then that's their requirement. And then you show it to the web developer, and the web developer says, okay, well, we can kick out an email. Do you want the email to be plain text, or do you want it to be HTML? Do you want the email to be formatted? Do you want your logo in there? Does it matter? Does the website need to be responsive to mobile device screen sizes, or should it be fixed width? All these questions come up, right? Well, we need those answered before we sign off on this project, and start moving forward with work. So those are requirements that the originator just didn't even know about. Yeah. Okay. So we now need to go back to the originator and ask them, and they start to give us more details. So we put that in our collection plan here. How do we collect the resources? Do we need to go through more, the requirements, do we need to go through it more than once to make sure that we actually get it all right and straightforward? All right. How are we going to handle analysis and categorization of the requirements? Analysis is just looking at them to determine, one, whether we've got the right steps in place to achieve them, and two, whether we've achieved them. Yeah. Categories, you'll have some requirements, I think we were talking about it before the show, where I said a lot of times I'll have primary requirements, secondary requirements, and optional requirements. Primary, those are the ones that we have to achieve. We've got to get these done. Secondary ones are ones that we would like to achieve that can change if necessary. If things start running behind schedule, whatever, we might be able to eliminate them, but the things that we'd like to achieve. Yeah. And then optional requirements are, if things are running perfect, let's try and get these done too. But if we don't, they're the first things to cut. We're not worried about it. We can always do that in version 2.0 or whatever. So how do we define those categories? And who makes that decision? Who makes the decision over what's primary, secondary, and optional, right? So we define that structure here. Not saying in our project, here's the primary requirements. That's not for this document. This is the plan. What documentation is required when we collect resources? What do we need to get from people, right? Do we need to get it in writing? Is it just a phone call? Because a phone call, man, it's hard to get signatures on a phone call. So, what documentation is necessary to collect requirements and have them stored and accepted? Prioritization. If you got more than one set of, or more than one requirement, which ones are the most important, which ones are the least? That way we can do our scheduling appropriately. For high priority requirements, you might assign some extra resources to guarantee success. For low priority requirements, you might assign the minimum resources, knowing that if they don't succeed, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Metrics, how do we measure the requirements? A lot of requirements are really easy. Hey, I want a form on my website, and when somebody hits submit, I want it to send me an email. All right? Well, if I hit submit, did I get an email? Yes or no? Yes?
There you
It
go.
worked.
Yep.
No, it didn't, right? So a lot of metrics are really easy to measure. Some are harder, though. I want my website to look modern. Okay, well, who's the judge of what looks modern, right? So that's a subjective thing. So we have to put in here in our plan that anything that's subjective, we need to come up with a way to measure it. So everything's got to be measurable. So we say, all right, for any subjective thing, we're going to use focus groups. And with the focus groups, we need a opinion rate of 75% or higher. So if 75% of the polled people in the focus group say, yeah, it looked modern, then that counts, right? And so how do we measure that? And we could take things that are subjective and turn them into quantifiable, numerical values that we can represent and use to gauge success. Real important that you get buy-in on this stuff from the sponsor because, again, it's subjective. You could have a website that 100% of your focus group attendees say looks modern, but if the sponsor looks at it and says, that looks like 1997, well, you're going to argue with the sponsor?
Yeah.
But if you have it in paper, here's how we measure it, the focus groups agree, this is modern. That's the kind of thing that you have to worry about. Traceability structure. When we have requirements get tied to other things. They're tied to the people that originated them. That's something we want to know. They're tied to the testing that verifies we met them. And one requirement might be tied to another requirement. So we need traceability to keep all of this intact. You also have like billing that you need to track too. Like you're having to pay different people to create these various requirements, to create the deliverable from the requirement. And so where's that getting billed, cost of account, or code of accounting and all that good stuff. We need to keep track of that. So we define right here, again, how we're going to track that kind of stuff, which ties into tracking. And reporting, those are kind of all tied together right there, right? Traceability, tracking, and reporting. Traceability and tracking, keeping a record of how all this ties together, and then reporting how we're going to output information about it. So when a requirement is met, we know that because we've got our tracking and traceability. And then how do we report on that, right? Are we going to be sending emails and so on? What tools are available for us for reporting? Because you'll find in like high security environments, there's some tools that are not available to you. So if it's a medical project and you're transmitting medical records, standard email is not a tool that's available. And so we would define that under reporting. Validation, right? We say we've met the requirement. How do we validate it? So again, the tools and techniques and stuff that's available to us for validating that. And lastly, configuration management. I love how they just stick this in here as a single entry. We're going to talk a lot more about that. Configuration and change management are two really important things. If they're not properly followed, they can scuttle an entire project really easy. So you definitely want to make sure you implement those properly, and so we'll spend some time on it later. They've just got a little blurb here, and that's because they're actually talking about change of the requirements, right? But we're going to take a look at change later on in terms of the entire project and how it is an extremely important thing. And so here is just a little blurb, but we will have more. All right, some of the other plans, I don't want to bore us to death going through each one of these, especially since we haven't covered We haven't done our human resources management episode yet, and stuff like that, where we'll really start to understand that plan. But just taking a look at another one, this is a good one here, your risk management plan. All right. For me, I'm an IT guy, right? I've managed IT projects. I understand technology. I understand people and how to get them to work. I'm not a risk manager. So when it comes to quantifying risk, I can ballpark it. I can come up with ideas of likelihood and stuff, but it's not founded on generally accepted principles and stuff like that. So a risk management plan is going to define exactly how we go about that. So let me pull that one up. Here we go. So it starts off by defining a methodology. What is the accepted methodology in your company for identifying the risk, quantifying them, and then setting up the necessary measures to insulate us from the risk, right? So this is what our company does in regards to risk, all right? Then the roles and responsibility. Who is it that's going to deal with this? And for me, I've usually had a risk manager, either on my staff or somebody that we contracted to come in. You can find people all over that have a master's degree in risk management, and they're really knowledgeable, and they know stuff that'll blow your mind.
Yeah.
Well, unless you're a risk manager, then it won't blow your mind. But if you're like me, it's amazing some of the stuff they know and how they can assign numbers to things, and it's impressive.
Quantifying risk. Yep.
Then we'll say our risk categories. When we start to rank our risks, we're going to have, and the terminology is up to us, right? You might have high risk, low risk, medium risk, whatever. What terminology do we use, right? And based on that terminology, how do we attach certain risks to that terminology, right? How do we act upon that? Risk management funding, right? If we have to bring in contractors, who pays for that? Now, when you talk about risk analysis, risk is insulating our company from the potential loss of a project failing or whatever. Well, is that part of the project budget or is it part of the company's budget? A lot of companies have their own risk management to make sure projects are successful that doesn't come out of the project budget. So that would be defined in here. Contingency protocols. What are our standard methods as a backup plan? You'll see this most commonly in terms of a reserve, right? Reserves in terms of cash or reserves in terms of time, and I almost always see it in cash. So you might say that as a general principle in our company, we reserve 10% of our budget for insulating for risk contingencies, right? And so that way, if we start to fall behind schedule, we've got 10% of our budget sitting there, we can hire more people to come in and try and get back on schedule or whatever. But that would be a general policy or procedure that's set up for our organization. Frequency and timing. If we're monitoring for the risk, how often do we need to be monitoring for it? Do we need to be watching out for that risk every day, once a month? Is it based on the length of the project? How do we determine that frequency and timing? All right. A lot of this other stuff is pretty common sense. Stakeholder risk tolerances. We're going to talk about all this again in the risk episode. But you'll see down here what I was talking about earlier, definitions of probability. When I say something is a very high risk, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, it might mean that there is an 80% chance or higher that it's going to occur. All right. Well, my company as a whole needs to define this word so that when I say something is a very high risk, and when Ronnie says something is a very high risk,
We know what we're talking about.
yeah, we mean the same thing. We need context. Because to me, high risk, I might be a risk seeker.
Right.
So high risk to me is like 90% or higher, right? But Ronnie might be risk averse. So 40% or higher might be very high risk to him. So our company needs to define a standard. And that goes right here in our risk management plan. Very high risk is 80% or greater chance of occurrence. And you go down the line assigning what that is. Very low risk, right? 5% or lower, whatever we consider to be low. We define each one of those and what they mean. So that measure and then what they mean. So you specify that right in here. It's a definition. And then the definition of impact by objective. So we're saying, all right, if something is very high risk, how do I define its impact? How much damage could it do to our project? And how much damage could it do at each of these areas, right? Damage to cost, damage to scope, damage to quality or time. When something is a very high risk, something very high risk with the scope, that could be a big deal, very hard to correct. But something very high risk with quality, that can be overcome. If we're manufacturing something and it's got a flaw in it, we can correct the flaw and move on. So something that's very high risk might not have a giant impact on quality, but it might have a giant impact on scope or time or cost, right? Some organizations don't do these separate. They merge scope and quality together, because technically your scope has your requirements determine your quality. So those kind of get tied together. It's up to your organization. Remember, all of this is customizable. All right. So we take all of these different things and we're going to put them together into this overall project plan. So I want to talk more about that, but we're right up on our break time. So why don't we do this? Why don't we stop and take a break? Yep. And when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit more about this overall project management plan. And then this is going to be a short episode, so we'll probably wrap up after that. So stay tuned. We'll be back after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were talking about the project management plan in general. We kind of looked at some of the different components in it. Like I said, I've got templates for every single one. I just don't want to dive too deep into each of them because we're going to address each one individually as we get to the risk section or the cost section, the schedule, and so on. So we'll take a look at those plans as we move forward. But let's take a look at the develop a project management plan process as a whole here. So I've got one of my handy dandy drawings fired up. There we go. And I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but I did these drawings just because I like them. And and you find them all through the PMBOK, except the way they do them is a little more dry. If we just kind of skim through and see, there was one. Yeah. So a little bit more dry, but basically it's just representing everything you need to know about that particular process. So I love these diagrams because if you're studying, this really does point you in the right direction to find out what you need. If you're comfortable with every single entry in these lists, if you know all about the inputs, tools and techniques, and the outputs, then you know everything you need to know about that process. So that's why I keep going back to these diagrams right here. I just like them. Yeah. So on the input side, we already talked about this a little bit. The project charter may well be the only document that we have in hand at this stage in the game, right? So in the last episode, we came up with a project charter for our IT Pro TV arcade cabinet project, and Nate and I signed off on it. So we've got this signed project charter. We did do a couple other documents as a part of that. So we'll see, we did a stakeholder analysis matrix, and we did a stakeholder register. Now, those serve as inputs here too, but they don't have a lot of value in terms of making a plan, right? Maybe a little bit, but not much. So not everything is a great input for this one, even though it says output from other processes. And they're really just referring to the other planning processes that, if I go back here, all these various planning processes have plan scope management, plan schedule management, and so on. Now, there are 47 different processes spread across this chart, and going down this line of planning, every single one of them has a plan statement in it, plan stakeholder management, plan procurement management, and so on. If your company has a very well-defined project management plan already in place, then you pretty much get to skip all these ones that say plan schedule management, plan cost management. You still have to do all these other ones, right? Define activities and so on. But the ones that are talking about planning management, those will already be done as part of your project management plan. So there's 10 processes right there that you don't have to worry about. So you go from 47 down to 37. So this giant complex model starts getting smaller and smaller. Not to mention that there's certain aspects that might not apply to you. So cost management, maybe that's handled entirely by your accounting department and you're not actually allowed to manage that. So then here's 4 more processes that go out the door, I guess 3 if you don't count planning. So you start whittling this down to a much more manageable number. All right. But going back to this, once we get our data together, we then apply some tools and techniques to it. Expert judgment, what's in your brain, right? We look at the plan and we say, all right, does the plan meet the needs of our project? Yeah. Or does our project have something unique in it that this overall plan doesn't address, right? For example, all the documents that I showed you were from the perspective of having one project. What if your project has sub-projects? If you've got sub-projects, you're going to need to add to this management plan about how you manage those sub-projects and the sub-project managers that are attached to them and so on. So it adds a little more complexity. You might need to customize the management plan to get it the right way for your project. All right. And then we've got facilitation techniques. And we talked briefly about that in another episode, but to go a little more in depth on it, we'll go way in depth on it in the human resources section, but just to go a little more in depth, this is made up of several things. I think we talked about brainstorming, right? And mind mapping, how we can start to just gather data together. Well, you might get the other project managers together or your project management team and say, okay, let's all think of what we need to do or what we need to address as far as our project management plan. We start to take all those templates that I showed you and fill them out. And so you might have different people filling out different plans based on their job roles. And so we're creating that plan, getting the right people working on the right things. Other things that we have in there, conflict resolution. When two people disagree, we've got to find some resolution to that. And a lot of it's common sense, resolving a conflict. But we'll see in the human resources section that there's actually 5 prescribed methods for resolving a conflict that we need to know for the exam. And so we'll take a look at those later on. Definitely be aware of that. We got problem solving. The problem solving is just, again, it's kind of what's up here. You got an issue, you need to first off recognize that you have the issue, right? That's, what is it? Step 1 to knowing you have a problem is knowing you have the problem. I think that's alcoholism. And anyhow, but it's the same thing, right? So, so step 1, we identify it, and then step 2, we figure out whether it's something that we can solve or not. You need to, this is Tim, one of the gentlemen that we work with, he has this saying, which is, you don't know what you don't know, right? So we need to recognize when we just don't know something, and we need to bring somebody else in to assist with it. So problem solving might not be something we do. We might solve the problem by hiring somebody else to solve the problem.
And lastly, your favorite, the idea of meetings. Yeah, meeting facilitation for us is actually a very important part of it. Once again, making sure that the meeting moves, making sure that we actually do have action items that are actually going to be accomplished at the end here. These are all goals that we can actually set up here to help us to come up with that overall project plan for us as well. And again, we may actually start assigning some of the different ones to different people.
So that's all going to happen there, and then basically we feed all that information together. We may have to do several revisions. This is where the version numbers really start to come in handy, because I might have a cost management plan version 1.0, but then we make some adjustments. Now it's version 1.1 and 1.2, and when we have a meeting, we need to announce that and say, okay, today we're going to be taking a look at cost management plan version 1.3. All right, does everybody have 1.3? Oh, you still have 1.2. Let me give you the updated copy, right? You make sure that everybody's working from the same data and that they're all kind of in sync, right? That's the important part. When it's all said and done, this is going to get put into your overall project management plan. And if you're a small company, your project management plan may not exist. You might just be flying by the seat of your pants. It might be one page, just a high-level overview. But if this is a high-dollar project, if this is something that's in a very formalized environment, your project management plan may be called a project management book. There are companies that call it that. And it may be a spiral-bound book or something like that that is 100 pages, 200 pages, but it's basically saying, here's how you, as a project manager, need to act on this project. So they do that because if they hire new project managers, how does the new project manager know how our company does business? Well, they've got to learn it. And if we want them to learn fast, we already have a book that shows them. You give them our project management plan, and we say, here is how we manage projects. And in that book, you have all of these management plans that we're talking about, cost, schedule, human resources, all that stuff defined in there, how we manage it, and you put all your templates in that book. Here's the templates for all the forms and things that you might use. Here's how we like to have them arranged, right? At your last company, you might have had a template that you used for scope statements, and it might have been great. But that's not the one we use. We use a consistent form here. Here's the form. Fill it out. Make sure you follow our method, right? Consistency across projects makes monitoring and governance so much easier, right? So much more possible. All right. So that's an important thing. This gets put together, and you have the generic plan that's a part of your company's organizational process assets, but you may also have to create a custom one just for your project if it's different. And if that's the case, then you got to do that. You got to revise it, make sure it meets your needs. And if it's some kind of improvement, maybe you push that improvement to the general plan that applies to your company. But if it's just for this one project, you modify it there and it becomes a part of your project documentation. When we wrap up this project, at the very end, when everything is done, we're going to put together our project archive. It's a collection of all the data that we generated during our project. And this project management plan should be one of the very first things in there. It's not going to be the first, but the charter's there. But it's going to be one of the first things, because we use that to gauge whether we've followed the plan throughout the project. And when there's a failure, a lot of times you can trace that failure back to not following the plan. The proper form wasn't submitted with the proper information. Well, in the plan, it defined what form to use and what information to put on there. We just didn't do it. So there's where our failure started. So definitely important stuff, all a part of that project management plan. All right, well, once we've got that in place, or if we've already got it, we've been given it by our company, now we're ready to get to work. Now, if you've already got it from your company, you're done, you're in business. If you have to create it yourself, you probably haven't created it at this point, right? We have an idea now. We have a collection of templates. That's great. But now we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So what we're going to do is in the upcoming episodes, we're going to move through each of our areas. Like the next one that we're going to hit is Scope management?
Scope management.
So when we get into scope management, we're going to talk about how we draft our scope, what we're looking for, what goes in there, how we manage the scope and all that. And we'll talk about that scope management plan, what goes into how we manage the scope. And so we'll kind of create that as we go along the way, and then that all gets gathered together into this overall project management plan. Just keep in mind, it doesn't have to be crazy complex, doesn't have to have a million words in it. The more simple it is, the easier it is to follow. The more words you get in, it becomes really complex. Like the story I always heard was the United States tax code. Did you know that in the very first draft of the United States tax code, it was 7 pages long? 7 pages. So any citizen could sit down and read 7 pages and understand how taxes work and pay their taxes, right? Today, they have what's called the IRS Tax Library. It's an actual library. It's got thousands of volumes of not just the tax law, but the case law, which is interpretations of the law, and nobody understands how it works anymore, and you have to hire an accountant just to file your taxes. So it's kind of gotten out of hand. Well, that's how your project management plan can get also. The more simple it is, the easier it is for project managers to follow it. The more complex it becomes, now the project manager needs an assistant who's spending their time just tracking project management plan and making sure it's being followed, versus what the project manager is doing, which is hopefully managing the project, managing the people, and getting things moving. So it becomes very, very challenging when you have a really complex project management plan.
Yeah, sometimes you actually have to remember, right? If you're new to this, if you're going, hey, I want to take an interest in this, is remember that the plans that we're talking about are not actually talking about the actions that we're doing, and really talking about how we're going to manage those things that are coming up. So keep that in mind as we actually start moving through the next episodes here in terms of what we're actually doing. We're actually talking about how we actually manage all the stuff that needs to be done.
All right, well, Ronnie, why don't we wrap it up here? If we go any further, we're going to get into stuff that's going to be covered in the other episodes, so I don't want to do too much overlap. So I think that's a pretty good coverage of it. Let me remind you guys, if you have any questions on this stuff, live during the show, you can go to itpro.tv/live. You can post your questions right in the chat room on there, and we monitor and answer during the show. If we're not live, if it's showing reruns or whatever, make use of our Q&A forums. Click on that Q&A link at the top of the screen. It'll take you in the forums. Post your questions there. We monitor and answer, so we want to make sure you get the information that you need. All right, well, signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Don Pizzette.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we will see you next time.